I'm Tom Campbell. I am a physicist, also a consciousness researcher, as are you, a consciousness researcher. And I've been doing both professionally until I retired for probably about 40 years. So my consciousness research and my getting out of graduate school and getting into the work world both happened around the same time in about 1970. So that's where my professional beginnings start. And within a few months of that, I was fortunate enough to get to meet Bob Monroe. And Bob Monroe, as you probably know, wrote Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. He was a guy who had spontaneous out-of-body. Matter of fact, I think that's his term. Out of the body is a term that he coined. He had spontaneous out-of-body experiences and didn't really know what to do with them. Matter of fact, they frightened him at first, and then he decided that he would go with it and play with it and see what he could do, see what he could control and what did it mean. So he did that, and his books pretty much represent his diary of his experiences when he was out of body. So I got to meet Bob in the very early 70s, about probably late in 1970, maybe early in 1971. And at that time, there was no Monroe Institute. None of that existed yet. But he had built a lab at his property. He was a wealthy gentleman. He was the owner and chairman of Jefferson Cable Company in Charlottesville, Virginia. So he was doing very well financially. So on his property, which he had quite a bit, about 500 acres of property in Virginia. So, whiteboard fence, horses, grazing in the fields, the Virginia gentleman thing, big white house on the hill, a little lake. So it was very, very nice property. And he built this lab and wanted to study consciousness, but he didn't really know how to go about that. And that was about the time myself and a friend of mine, electrical engineer, met him, and we volunteered to be his technical and his scientific help if he would teach us to do what he did. So that was the deal, and he agreed to that. And so Dennis and I started making trips out to, at that time it was Whistlefield Farms, which was his name of his estate. And we were putting in 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe. So that's about a half-time job. Plus we had jobs of our own. Dennis and I both worked at the same place. That's how we knew each other. And that began a reawakening for me in this, study and experience of consciousness. So I did learn to go out of body on demand. Just, Bob was good on his ability to teach us. Didn't take very long, maybe a year, maybe 6 months to a year. And what I wanted to do was evidential things, because I'm a scientist and I need proof. I need evidence. That's very important to me. So I did evidential things. I did remote viewing. We did healing. We did exchanging thoughts between two people that weren't connected to each other, that weren't able to hear or see each other. We just tried all kinds of experiments using the mind to see what we could accomplish in an out-of-body state, or even in a meditation state that was impossible, things that shouldn't be able to be done from a physicist's viewpoint, which is basically a materialist viewpoint. So after some years of that, I knew without a doubt that what we were doing was real. The effects were real. What we were able to affect, the remote viewing, how accurately we could describe targets the healings that we were doing, these were obviously real. And the statistics that we kept on it verified that, it was, I don't know, like 10,000 to 1 that we were just lucky. So the statistics were very good, but I still didn't get it at a deep level. And it's like that, you can understand things intellectually, but that's not the same as understanding things at what I call the being level, at a deeper
experiential
space.
level. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was experiencing all these things, but still, in my mind, it was like, well, that's interesting. And it sure is strange, but it's just hard to go there when you've been brought up in a culture where materialism is fundamental.
And trained specifically in a materialistic science.
Yeah. So anyway, the thing that kind of was the last straw, I guess, that got me to the point where I no longer asked, is this real, was an event that Bob thought up. He had both Dennis and I go out of body, meet above the lab, and then go on an adventure, an out-of-body adventure together. And he was recording Dennis's audio and my audio, at the same time. Now, he could talk to either one of us, but we could not talk to each other. Dennis and I were actually triply isolated from each other. We were both in an isolation booth with an empty isolation booth between us. So this was acoustic isolation, and the booth I was in was also electromagnetic isolation. It was a Faraday cage. So we did that, and when we came back after about, I think, close to 2 hours of doing this, Bob played both his audio and my audio together. In other words, he started them both. He rewound them to the beginning, started them both at the same time so that they'd be synced in time. And there, we were having conversations with each other, answering each other's questions. Oh, do you see that thing? Whatever. You mean the white thing with the red ball on top? Yes, that's the thing. And we were obviously at the same place at the same time, seeing and experiencing those things, having conversations. So I think at that point is when it took a giant shift from in my intellect knowing that it was true to in my intuitive side and my, at the depth, at the gut level, knowing that it was true. And after that, I stopped asking, is this real? Is it just a mind trick? Is it somehow my mind, playing tricks with me in some way that it, kind of biases me to see things in certain ways that I'm kidding myself. So after that, I didn't any longer say, is this true? And I kind of cut back on the trying to develop evidence because I really didn't need any more evidence. You only need so much evidence. And at that point, my mission was to understand, how did it work? Why did it work? What were its limitations? What's the structure behind it? Because obviously it was structured. There was logic behind it. It wasn't a random experience. There was logical structure behind it. You did certain things, you'd get certain, results.
Yeah, there were laws applying to that reality there.
Yeah, there were laws. There were rules that applied to that reality. So I wanted to understand them because that's what physicists do. They model reality. So for the next 35 years, my task was to, and that wasn't all with Bob Monroe. I was with Bob Monroe probably the best part of a decade, but then after that, I moved off and went to other places, moved out of that area and so on. But for the next 35 years, what I did was research in the non-physical. So I would do something in the non-physical, some evidential thing, and then I'd change a variable, and then I'd do it again and see how that variable affected what I did. And I'd then have to repeat that maybe 10 or 20 times to make sure that it wasn't just a one-off. You can't just do something once. You have to do it a lot of times before you're confident that it's repeatable and that it's, a real event, not just a one-time oddity. So I did that, and there's lots of variables. It took a long time. It was very tedious work in the sense that you just have to get into exactly the same state and then repeat things that you were doing over and over again, changing variables until you realized what variables affected what? What was important? What wasn't important? What could you do? What couldn't you do? And why? And then I needed to come up with an understanding, one overall construct, logical construct that explained it. Because the reality, the non-physical reality, right, had rules, had structure, but it wasn't structure that was, how can I say, unrelated. If you were talking about remote viewing, or talking about healing, or talking about using your intent to modify weather patterns, or whatever it is you were doing, it's not like each one of those was a separate thing. It was obviously all part of one thing. So there needed to be one model, one understanding of how that worked, that would explain all of it. So then, as a physicist, I had discovered in this tedious research of mine what some of the facts of consciousness were. All right, here are the facts. Here's how this works. And I knew the facts of the objective world because that's what physics is. It's basically understanding the facts of the objective world. So then my job was to find the overarching understanding, the viewpoint, the paradigm, however you want to put it, that explained both the subjective and the objective. Because all the paranormal things all happen in the subjective world. They all happen in the intuitive side of your thinking and your thought process. They're all on the intuitive side. The physical world is all in your intellectual side. You learn about that. You learn how the physical world works. But that's a measurement thing. You measure it. It's a objective intellectual process. The paranormal things and consciousness was all on the intuitive side. So anyway, I worked on that for that 35 years, and finally I thought I understood it well enough to tell somebody else. So I wrote these books called, My Big Toe. It's a trilogy of 3 books, and altogether it's just under 1,000 pages. And it was basically a theory of consciousness. And I knew at that time, one of my facts of consciousness was that consciousness is fundamental and the physical world is not. And I knew that because I could change things in the consciousness side that would affect the physical side. But I couldn't change things in the physical side that affected the consciousness side, you see. So the arrow of causality travels from consciousness to the physical. Therefore, physical is a subset, consciousness is the superset. So I knew that. So that's just an example of one fact, of consciousness.
Sure. And of course, when you say My Big Toe, TOE is an acronym for Theory of Everything, just so people aren't confused.
Yeah, TOE is a theory. And well, actually, to explain the name, TOE is a theory of everything. And Albert Einstein kind of started that acronym, TOE, Theory of Everything, when he was trying to unify both quantum physics and relativity, because quantum physics and relativity kind of have a fundamental philosophical disagreement between them. They do not, one does not just run seamlessly into the other. They kind of object to each other in a fundamental philosophical way. So he and everybody else knew that there must have been some other understanding at a higher level from which both quantum physics and relativity could be derived. And that's what he was looking for, a TOE, a theory of everything. Because in those days, and still true, quantum physics and relativity basically are everything, in physics, that they describe all of the objective world. So his theory of everything was really a theory of how quantum physics and relativity both can be generated from some more general overarching understanding. Well, that's a TOE. And I call that a little toe because it's only a toe of the objective world. Now, it's just a little toe. I had a big toe because I not only could describe the physical world with my toe, I could indeed show how quantum physics and relativity, both came out of my toe. I did what Einstein wanted to do, but besides that, I also had an understanding of the subjective world. So this was a theory that was a science of the subjective world and a science of the objective world, both. So yes, I could derive quantum physics and relativity from first principles, but I also could come up with things like, what's our purpose here? Why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? What's the point of our life? And if you're unhappy or struggling or anxious or depressed, this theory will tell you exactly why that is, and exactly what you have to do, to not be. Now, I say exactly, I'm talking about, the theory of why things are the way they are, not necessarily exactly, every detail, but this is big picture, fundamental things. So anyway, that's my big toe. And the reason I put my in there wasn't because I was so proud of it, that it was mine, but I put my in there because if it's not your experience, it can't be your truth. Okay, so if you've never experienced consciousness as I have, then the things I tell you about the consciousness system are just something that you can believe or disbelieve or kind of put on the side and say, well, maybe, I don't either believe them or disbelieve them, but that's all you can do with it. It's not really yours. Your truth has to be based on your experience. So it's important that everyone stay skeptical and open-minded. That's a key thing. You can't make progress if you're not skeptical. And when I say skeptical, I mean about everything. You must be skeptical about everything, including anything that I say, or anything that you say. You always have to be skeptical. And the thing you have to be most skeptical about is yourself, because we are very good at convincing ourselves, that things are the way we want them to be. That's just, we humans are very good at that. So in any case, skepticism is a requirement. So now I have this model. It's a scientific model. It's a logical model that explains both physics and explains not only makes the paranormal normal, but explains all of the subjective world. All right. So that being said, that kind of says where I came from and, what I've done, where I am. And I guess I'll turn it back over to you then. So now you can go wherever you want to go with that. I understand that your interest is in life after death possibilities.
That's kind of the main focus of my research, yeah, although it does kind of course, that question itself encompasses all of the nature of the mind and the nature of consciousness. And there's a lot to unravel in your life because you've done so much. So let's start, I suppose, from the beginning with Robert Monroe and his books. So for those who don't know, Robert Monroe is probably the pioneering name in out-of-body exploration. Wrote, as you say, these 3 books which document his experiences from when they first began to up until the end of when he wrote about them. And he, of course, has the Monroe Institute, or had the Monroe Institute before he passed, and it's still there. I actually purchased the Gateway Experience CD set. Unfortunately, I started doing them and then ran out of time, and I had other things, and how things get pushed to the back. But I do intend to carry them on. Many people, understandably so, see not only the Monroe Institute but other institutes that promote this kind of what they would consider pseudo-scientific or fringe scientific things as obvious money-making scams or money-making schemes that are based on nothing more than kind of tricking the gullible into parting with their money. What would you say to those who claim that kind of thing?
Well, the thing I would say is you need to give it a try. Talking about things that you haven't experienced is obviously is talking out of ignorance rather than talking out of experience. So give it a try, and give it a try with an open mind and with being skeptical. And if you give it a try, by that I mean a serious try, not just, oh yeah, I'll go see if it works, and do something and it won't work. Of course, that's not going to work that way. We're talking about developing your intuitive side. Now, we spend all of our lives developing our intellectual side. We start in kindergarten, learning our alphabet and learning, speech and learning arithmetic. And we spend our whole life learning in our job, everything we do. And we tend to live through our intellect, particularly in Western culture. We tend to live out of our heads, is the way it's often phrased. But that's just one avenue, one of two avenues for understanding and information processing and I don't know what to say, learning. That's just one of two. The other side is the intuitive side. Now, the person who is a materialist that says if it isn't material, then it isn't real, therefore consciousness isn't real because consciousness isn't material, those kind of people have only used and have only developed their intellectual side, their logical side. And they will probably deny that they even have an intuition or that intuition exists. But that's their loss. Intuition does exist. Intuition is a real thing. And it turns out that if you develop that intuitive side, you will find that it can be even more accurate and more reliable than the intellectual side. Now, in the beginning, when you haven't developed it very much, it's not so reliable and it's not so accurate. If your intuition is what you call a gut guess, well, then it's just a guess. And okay, you might get it right, maybe even more often than wrong, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about guessing. I'm talking about getting information from that intuitive side. And you can check that information, when you get evidential information, and you can get just as accurate and just as reliable getting information through the intuitive side. Now, we use this a lot, but we tend to use it like most people have out of bodies. Most of the people's out of bodies are spontaneous. They don't do out of bodies on demand. It just happens when it happens. And sometimes they develop little rituals that they go through to make it happen. And then it kind of happens more frequently. But even that is rare. That's the few people. The great number of people who have had out of bodies, they just happen spontaneously. Well, it's the same with over on the intuitive, with the intuitive side. That's the way we tend to get that information. Sometimes we'll just get a download, we'll get information that we just know something is the way it is, or it just happens and it's intuitive. And sometimes it's just amazingly correct. And sometimes it's wrong because we are not really very good at that intuitive side, so we're kind of sloppy with what we do. If you had somebody who never went to school, never learned an alphabet, never learned how to do anything, well, their logic would be pretty ratty. Their thinking, their intellectual processing would be pretty poor. They wouldn't do very well. They would have a hard time seeing logical paths, this because of this, because of that, because of the other thing, therefore this, that would be very hard, if not impossible, for them to do. Well, the intuitive side's the same way. If you don't practice it and work on it for years, just like the intellectual side, then you're not going to be good at it. But you will get little bursts of it now and again whenever it happens. So many of the big scientific and technical breakthroughs come in what's called aha moments. Usually these aha moments come when people are relaxed, when they're not thinking about the problem, their mind is open, but they have this kind of issue that they're trying to solve. They don't know the solution, but they kind of let it go for a minute and just let their mind open, and then bam, there it is. And they have this aha moment. Oh, I see, I get it, and they go on. And that's true of artists, when they paint or sing or, do whatever they do, whatever kind of art it is, writers, all kinds of people who solve problems, not just on the art side, but on the technical side. You get insight comes. A lot of that, of course, is coming from the intuitive side, but it doesn't happen on demand. It happens whenever it happens. And you kind of have to get yourself in the right mindset. You have to not be too focused on anything in particular, Well, that's just putting yourself in a meditation state, opening yourself up. And then you can get some information from that intuitive side. But unless you've exercised the intuitive side and experienced it, then for you, it doesn't exist. And materialism will tell you it doesn't exist because intuition doesn't have a material basis. Therefore, it doesn't exist. But materialism is just a belief. It's not a fact. It's just a belief. And it's an erroneous belief because there are those who do practice on that intuitive side, and they can develop those skills, and they can repeatedly and very accurately do all kinds of amazing things, like remote view, like heal, and they, or, artists who live in that space and are very creative. That's where your creative abilities come from. That's where the synthesis comes from, where you put all these various ideas together and then it expresses itself in some creative way. It all comes out of your intuitive side. So people who are very left brain are not very intuitive. The right brain's kind of your intuitive side, if we want to put it into the right brain, left brain metaphor. And it really, if you want to live a whole life in a much larger reality, you need to be whole-brained. If you're just right-brained, then everybody calls you a space cadet and doesn't give you any credibility, but you know things that they don't know, and you understand things that they don't understand, but you can't explain it to them. So you struggle. If you're just left-brained and only do intuitive process, well, you'll probably have a higher salary than the right brain person because our culture values that a lot more. But you will probably be arrogant in the sense that you think all of those right brain people are just kind of goofy. And you think all that right brain holistic stuff is all nonsense. And you think all that paranormal stuff is nonsense and so on. So your life is very limited. You're living in a little world, in a little universe of material things. And what's unfortunate about that is that if you look at the things that are objective versus the things that are subjective, you'll find out that all the richness and meaning and significance in your life, or at least most of it, is on the subjective side. The objective side, the stuff. Well, it's nice. I mean, we all need to live in a house and we all need to have a car to drive around in and have clothes to wear. And the stuff is important, but that's not where the significance in your life comes from. The significant stuff in your life comes from relationship, from caring, from love, from, from all of those things that are not objective.
Mm. And you can argue that
meaningful things.
You could argue that even the value or supposed value of that comes from the objective things, the monies, the houses, the cars, whatever else, the value of those is also a subjective phenomenon because, in and of themselves, pieces of metal or shiny gold coins or whatever are valueless in and of themselves until the idea develops in the subjective human mind. So I suppose all value is subjective by definition.
It is. Well, actually, if we want to get picky about it, we would say that there is no such thing as an objective world. There is no objective world. Everything is subjective. But that part of the subjective world that is very low, has very low uncertainty, very, very small uncertainty about it, we call that objective. But it's really not objective because there's nothing in the objective world that has zero uncertainty. For instance, here's a brick. Imagine a brick. That's an objective thing. It's an objective brick. It's made out of clay. It was kilned, dried, and fired, and hardened, and it's a brick. Now, if I give you the task of finding its dimensions, well, you'd say that's an objective task. Okay, I'll measure it. Oh, but how do you measure a brick precisely? You can't. If you say, well, it's this long, well, if I measure it a little more accurately, it's not that long, really. It's that long plus or minus some error. So you'll never measure that brick any more accurately than your equipment allows you to measure it. So you measure it with a wavelength of laser light. Well, you're only going to measure it down to 8 decimal places. That 9th decimal place is subjective. And when we start defining let's say the length of that brick, well, what is the length of a brick? Well, when we look at it and we can put a ruler against it, it's pretty clear. It's, say, 6 inches long. But actually, it's not 6 inches long. That's just an approximation, you see. And how do you define where that brick stops and starts? Because you get down to the molecular level, which is what defines the brick, that brick is full of lumps and valleys and peaks and things. Well, how do you measure? What does it belong to? From this peak to the other peak on the other end, or from the valley, or from an average between those two? And then those molecules are moving. They're in motion. They're not sitting still. That whole side of that brick is just, like this all the time. It's moving around. So what exactly is the volume of that brick or the length of that brick? Well, you don't know. It's changing. What's the mass of that brick? Well, everything has a vapor pressure. Everything loses molecules because some molecules just happen to get enough energy to break the bonding that keeps them in that brick, and they fly off. Everything has a vapor pressure, even steel, concrete, bricks, everything has a vapor pressure. So even the mass of the brick is constantly changing, and other molecules are running into that brick and sticking there. So it's gaining and losing and things. So when you get down to a detailed level, you'll see that it's entirely subjective. But because the uncertainty is low, it's only out in that 8th decimal place where it's fluctuating, then we approximate it. Well, and we call it, right, and we call it an objective thing. But it's not. It's really a probabilistic and statistical thing because it's moving. It's changing. So everything is really a statistical thing. So nothing is, when you say objective, that means it just is. It's fixed. And nothing's fixed. So in that sense, there is no objective world. There's only a subjective world. And in that part of the subjective world where the uncertainty is very small, it's approximately objective. So that's our objective world. It's only approximately objective. So, I don't know. That's kind of a picky detail, but I thought I'd just throw that in.
It's perfectly relevant, as you say. You're quite right. Only on the macro level are things really stable, I suppose.
Only on the macro level do things appear to be, approximately objective. So it all gets down to a matter of opinion. Oh, I think that brick is this long. Well, I don't. I think it's that long, And how can you prove which one's right? Well, you can't, because that brick isn't an objective thing. Only to a certain
you can always go down in infinitely specific values of measurement.
Right. So that's the point is that I was making, is that everything that's really important, though, to our life, everything that all of our decisions we make that are important, that are life-changing decisions, like who shall I marry? Shall I marry Sally or shall I marry Sue? Well, that's a choice of mine. And how do I make that choice? Do I make it logically? No, there's not enough information to make that choice logically. Unless you have a crystal ball that can show you everything that'll happen in the next 50 years, you can't make that choice logically. So how do you make that choice? You make it mostly intuitively. How do you feel about that. You see? And if you have a good intuitive side, then you make it with information. If you don't have a good intuitive side, you're guessing. You see, you don't have that information. But all the things that will change your life, like who do you marry? How many children are you going to have? How are you going to raise your children? You know, that sort of thing. It changes your life. What job will I take? What am I going to do with my life? Where's my career? Should I quit this job and take another one? These things are all going to change your life. Should I join this organization or not? They're going to change you. None of them are logical. Most all of them require an intuitive choice. Or if you don't have an intuition, they require a guess. You see, so again, where there's more uncertainty, now you move over into the intuitive side. That's where your analysis has to be on the intuitive side if you don't have all the information that's required to make a logical choice. And mostly we don't. So if you look at those two sides, the objective side and the intuitive side, well, the intuitive side actually comes out as being a much bigger and more meaningful and significant part of your life than that objective side. You know, the objective side's the props on the stage. That intuitive side are what the actors are thinking and saying. You know, it's what's being portrayed. It's the life. It's the story that's being played out.
It's the fundamental part of the play itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're a materialist, then you basically go to a play and watch the props. And to you, there isn't anything in that play except props. It's just the stuff. There's nothing going on except the stuff. And all of that stuff's objective, and it just sits there and looks the way it looks and is the way it is and appears to be objective. And that's all that's important, and that's all that's significant. Well, you see, that's a pretty limited viewpoint of life. So obviously people who are materialists deal all day long with their intuitions and with things that are on the intuitive side and things that are on the subjective side. They just don't want to really admit it. They think that that's not really something that exists in itself.
Yeah, or if it does, it's fundamentally a phenomenon of mental or not mental, of material processes in the brain, for instance.
Right.
Right. So many people who are materialists, especially, would be opposed when you say that the paranormal phenomena, or what I don't like the word paranormal, because to me anything paranormal is natural, just unexplained currently. But they would argue that nothing paranormal has ever been repeatably shown to exist, you know, objectively, as you say, that you've done with the Monroe Institute and have the statistics to back them up. So I suppose, why do you think most in the scientific community believe that paranormal phenomena has not been repeatably and reliably shown to exist? And what would you say your statistics show in terms of because the one thing with statistics that usually gets brought up is the difference between effect size and you know, probability value and that sort of thing. So what would you say on that regard?
Well, for the reason that the materialists will say that and take that viewpoint is because they are trapped in their belief in materialism. Materialism says those things can't exist because they don't have material basis. Therefore, they don't exist. You know, if anybody thinks they exist, then they're just hallucinating. They're being tricked. They're being
misunderstood what the research actually says. Yeah.
So if you are a materialist and if you are logically consistent, then you must agree that there is no such thing as consciousness. You must agree there's no such thing as time, and there's no such thing as free will, because materialism is logically, is the antithesis. You know, it's logically opposed to, logically the opposite of. It denies. Materialism denies free will, it denies consciousness, and it denies time. None of those things can exist. Okay, that because life and reality, in their viewpoint, is a big machine. You know, if you know all the state of the machine at this moment, you can compute everything is going to happen from there on. So that's determinism. Well, determinism philosophically is a dead end. Determinism doesn't go anywhere. If our world is deterministic, then there is no point. There is no learning. Learning not only takes time, you know, and growth, but it takes change. So if there's no time, there's no learning. If there's no consciousness, there's really no thought, no thinking. There's just the appearance of time and the appearance of that we're, you know, we have free will and that we have thought. But all really, it's just this thing that's done and doesn't change. This unchanging, complete, done thing. See, so what is that? Well, that's nothing. See, it comes up with a zero. Can't grow, can't evolve, can't change, can't create, can't stop, can't start, can't do anything. So basically, your reality is the null set. Nothing. So materialism has the, you know, the philosophical, you know, what can I say, the logical logical consequence of materialism is the null set. Nothing. So that just doesn't ring true to us. I mean, we have experience. We make choices. We make choices freely. That means we can make this choice rather than that choice. You know, people who are listening, going to listen to this, they have to make a choice to listen to it, or a choice to hit the stop button and not listen to it. They freely can make that choice. You see, so there is free will. Obviously, we see free will here. Of course, the materialists would say, oh, that's just an illusion of free will, an illusion of time. That's kind of totally, what can I say, unbelievable. That doesn't really compute. It doesn't make any sense. What's really real is that we're all nothing, and nothing happens, and nobody ever learns, and no choice is ever made, and that's what's real. Does that feel? Yeah. Does that feel like a good explanation?
It does make sense.
You know?
It does make sense to me because, I mean, at the core, you know, materialism is a very useful philosophy in understanding the physical world and the way it interacts and how it's usable. But it always comes to a brick wall when it comes to consciousness, because by definition, you know, in order for any illusion of free will or whatever to take place, there must be a conscious agent behind to have that illusion. And
yeah, oh yes, well their logic is very poor. You know, they will tell you that the reason there's no time is that reality is like a bunch of still frames in a movie. Okay, there's all these possibilities of the way things are. You know, it's sort of like it's akin to the many worlds theory. You know, there's all these possibilities. Everything that possibly could happen is there, and basically that's all fixed. But what we do is we jump from this frame to the next frame to the next frame to the next frame, and it makes it look like there's time and that things are moving and changing, but they really aren't. Well, what's wrong with that logic is that we have to jump. What do you mean we have to jump from frame to frame? How do you jump if there is no time? You see? So you can't jump from frame to frame to frame unless there's time. Now I'm in this frame, now I'm in that frame, now I'm in the next frame.
The jump would imply movement, which in order to exist would require time to move from one point to the other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way they explain that there's no time is by starting with the assumption that there is time so that you can jump. You see? I mean, it's just logical nonsense. So materialists are stuck in that because ever since Newton had this concept of the universe as the Clockwork Universe, I think is what it was called, Clockwork Universe. You know, it's a big machine. And physicists, scientists like that because it gave them a departure point. It gave them a break from the dominant force in society at that time, which was religion. And it it gave them a separation. Say, okay, that's religion over there. They make stuff up. We're science over here, and our knowledge comes from the results of experiments. You see, so it was a very attractive point of diversion there that science created their scientific method. It's all about experiment and so on. And within the approximately objective world, like you say, it's a very useful tool. It's an extremely useful tool. So we don't want to throw any of that away. That's necessary. We need that level of analysis. We need our intellect. We need to be able to to use logic. It's not that those are useless tools. Those are very important tools. But what that does is it ignores the larger part of reality, the larger, most meaningful part of reality. It's compared to a life that is balanced and has both developed their intuitive and their intellectual sides. That's a very sterile life. People who live out of their heads live a very sterile existence. It has just stuff in it and logical connections between the stuff. It has no richness. So that's the downside of being a materialist, is that you live in a little tiny reality full of stuff, and the things that everything's related to stuff. Stuff has to be the origin of everything. So there is no consciousness, there's no time, there's no growth, there's no learning. All of that is just an illusion. Everything that's important to you is an illusion. Well,
which would
that's
be,
not true.
Yeah.
You
but
see,
even if it was, that would be strange to me.
Consciousness is a fundamental thing. Yeah.
I was going to say, that's all right. No, I think there's a slight delay, but I was going to say, even the argument that it is an illusion doesn't make sense to me, because in order to have an illusion, you must have some consciousness in order to experience an illusion. So you're always coming back to that background consciousness is necessary.
Yeah. It's that same thing as you can't, the way you say that there's no time is you have to have time. It's that same sort of thing. It's nonsense. So any case, so to those kinds of people who say it's all nonsense and it's all a cheap trick to get money from fools, what they need to do is to get open-minded, not be so closed-minded. Be open-minded, but keep their skepticism, because skepticism is always important. And there are charlatans out there, no doubt, that would love to take your money if you let them. The world is full of people. Not only charlatans, but businessmen of all sorts and marketers of all sorts that would be happy to, give you a story in order to get your money. So, of course, that's possible. But you should be competent enough to tell the difference of when something is real and something isn't. And in order to experience your intuitive side, it takes a little time. You have to develop it. It's like going to somebody who never has been educated in any way at all. Has never even, like I say, approached arithmetic or language or anything. Just no intellectual work at all. To take them and say, here, I want you to read Moby Dick here and tell me what you think about it. You need to experience. These things exist. And that person would say, nah, I look at a book, all I see is a lot of ink squiggles all over a page and paper and stuff. Doesn't mean anything to me. It must be rubbish. You're just making all that stuff up. That means something. Well, how would you combat that? They're just saying that you're just making stuff up. You're a fool. Somebody's convinced you that all those squiggles on that page mean something, but they know they don't, because they look at them, doesn't mean anything to them. Well, you'd say, got to take some time. You're going to have to learn an alphabet. You're going to have to learn to read. You're going to have to take some effort to find out whether those squiggles actually do mean something. And there is a book that you can read that, tells a fantastic tale. You see? So it's the same way. Those people that say all the paranormal and all the intuitive things are all rubbish, it's because they've never developed any of that. They're completely ignorant of it. And for them to say, well, I can't do that, or I don't see that, therefore it must be rubbish. Well, no, it's just that you are so ignorant that you're not capable of doing or seeing that. But you can learn. Everybody can learn. You see, so take a little effort to learn. And if they want to learn something that's simple, two of the simplest things to learn to do that are paranormal, that you can convince yourself that it's real, is remote viewing and healing. Those two things aren't hard to do. They're very easy to do. And generally, I could take a person and, I do that. I offer courses like that where I teach that to people. Because in my books, I tell people, if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. So they came back to me and said, okay, well, how do we experience? Teach us, how can I experience it? So I said, all right, I'll teach some courses. So I do. And I have there's a course you can get that's online now that will teach you how to do all those paranormal things. And you take it at home. It's not all that expensive. It's not like you have to, spend a whole lot of money on it, but you do have to put in the time. You have to do the exercises and put in the time. And what I find in a course of, say, 50 or 60 people, about 80% have multiple paranormal experiences. Things that, evidential ones, not that, I talked to my dead grandmother. That's really not too evidential unless your grandmother told you something that you could check.
That's right.
But evidential experiences with remote viewing, primarily, that's easy to do, or with getting information out of the databases that exist on the intuitive side. Now, when we talk about things like databases on the intuitive side, in my model, my model is logical. My model is not, trust me, believe it, this is the way it is. My model is strictly science. It's logical. So it tells you, where does that data come from? Where's the data in the database come from? Why is it there? What's in that database? How did it come to be there? Yeah, how did it come to be there? And it explains all that stuff, quite logical. So, if my model is not you don't have to be intuitive to follow my model. All you have to be is logical and open, of course. And open. Yeah. And you can get that. So anyway, people like that basically say those things for two reasons. One, they're ignorant and don't know any better. Because they cannot see it, because they have not had that experience, then they think must be impossible. Because what they're thinking is that their normal intellectual process should be able to do that if it's doable. What they don't understand is your intellectual process doesn't do that. It's your intuitive process. It works in that world, not your intellectual process. The second reason that they will say that is because they have a very large majority that agree with them. So they're in the majority. So they don't feel like they need to justify that because that's a majority opinion. That's what their culture tells them is true. So they feel very confident and very sure that that's correct. Materialism is the way it is, and all of that woo-woo stuff is just nonsense. That people who have weak minds, believe. So it's just ignorance and arrogance that they have to be right because most of the people agree with them. And those two things is where that comes from. And the simple answer is that try it. Seriously try it. Learn it. Go Google remote viewing and keep Googling remote viewing till you run into a group of people who are really serious about it, who are doing it as a science, and learn from them. And if you practice it and work on it and follow instructions, you'll be able to do it yourself before very long. It's not that hard. Same with the healing. You can use your mind to heal. Now, healing is not as evidential because if somebody has a headache and you use your mind to get rid of that headache, and the headache goes away, well, the headache may have just gone away anyway. You see, you don't know. So like all things in medicine, you have to do lots of it, and you have to gather statistics. You have to heal, 1,000 headaches. And if all 1,000 of them went away immediately after you healed them, then that says there's a very high level of statistical significance there. If half of them went away and the other half didn't, or if none of them went away, then it's something else. So that's not as evidential because it requires you to do a lot more of it. On the other hand, sometimes the evidence is very, very strong because you can use your healing to heal somebody not that has a headache, because that's something that comes and goes, but somebody who has had an affliction that is chronic, and for the last 15 years, they've had this problem. They've been to physicians and nobody can do anything for them, and they've suffered this problem for 15 years, and you work on them, and within 2 days, they don't have that problem anymore. You see, now that has a lot more evidential,
weight
force.
To it. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a lot more weight to it. But those kinds of things happen a lot. I mean, I've done things like that many, many, many times. So again, you enter into it with the idea that it's probably not going to work and that it's probably not real, but you're going to be open-minded and see. And then you start getting successes and you start thinking, gee, that was lucky, or that was just something else. And eventually, if you work at it and develop that side enough, you will not ask, is it real anymore? Because it is. You've experienced it. Not only experienced it, but you can do it. It's and you can repeat it. So now people will say, you mentioned the things about where the results are very small. Well, you were probably talking about Pear Labs. Pear Labs was an offshoot of Princeton, and they did a lot of experiments there that people used their intents to modify, say, the average of a random number generator. Random number generator would generate random numbers. And the average, let's say if it's between 0 and 1, the average should be 0.5. Well, they could use their intent to make that average of that random number generator be 0.51. And they could do that consistently, you see. And the critics would say, yeah, but this is 0.51, or 0.500 or 1. It's real small, so it doesn't really matter. But that's not the point. You can only modify probability with your intent within the natural uncertainty of the event. So now the uncertainty of what that average comes to has to do with how many random numbers are you averaging. In other words, if you average 10 random numbers, then you don't expect to get a 0.5 because it's only 10 numbers. You might get a 0.3 out of 10 numbers, But if you do 1,000 numbers, then you're going to get something like, 0.501 or 0.499, something like that. Okay, so that's gotten a lot smaller. So that's the uncertainty. Is it going to be a little more or a little less out in the third decimal place? Because the uncertainty is small now if it's 1,000 or 10,000 numbers. Okay, but within that uncertainty, you can modify future probability, what that future is going to be. So you can raise it just a little bit. So, okay, let's say I have a random number generator and I make it come out 0.499. And I'm trying to lower it. And I make it 0.499, 0.498, 0.4999, 0.4972. And I have all these. But if I can do that 10 times in a row, make it come out, just slightly lower, that's the same thing as flipping a coin 10 times and getting heads every time. So what's the probability that you could do that? 1 in a million, you see? So even though the event that they're doing is very, very small, out in a third decimal place, say, that's not the point. The point is they can do that 10 times in a row. They can do that 20 times in a row or 50 times in a row, you see? So what they're doing is outrageously, impossible. It should be a little bit above or a little bit below 50-50. A little bit above, about as much as it is a little bit below. So, see, the materialists look at that, know that it must not be true because of their belief, come up with a reason why it's not true. Oh, you're just talking about little tiny changes. And then they throw it away, won't look at it anymore. They've dispensed with it. But again, ignorance and lack of experience. So it's ignorance and arrogance is why those people think the rest of us are all just weak-minded people who are easily taken advantage of. But their problem is they have a belief, and that belief cages them. All beliefs are that way. That's why you have to stay skeptical. Any belief you have about anything will be a trap, will put you in a cage, because once you have a belief, you no longer will accept information that is contrary to that belief. That's the nature of belief. And everybody who believes anything believes that that belief is a fact. That's the nature of belief. So people don't believe that their beliefs are beliefs. They believe that their beliefs are facts. As soon as they say, I believe that, well, it becomes a fact to them.
Especially when they're surrounded with people who agree with that belief.
Exactly.
I mean, a good example of that, and I'll bring it up a lot, but it's quite old, but it's still relevant, certainly online, is those who are reassured that their belief is correct, that all this is nonsense, because there's never been kind of a breakthrough example of anything paranormal been done beyond, like, they usually bring up the James Randi challenge and things like that, where, they've had the chance to show that these things are real and they've always failed. So therefore, and then of course you get a group of people who'll agree with that. So what's your thought on that sort of thing, the Randi challenge and these attempts to show?
Well, if you want to know whether it's real or not, just Google remote viewing. That's a simple one, right? There's probably 1,000 sites out there do remote viewing. Some of them are probably not very useful, but you'll find some that will. But the Randi challenge is a what do we call it? Now the words escape me. That's the trouble when you get old. Words just jump out of your mind, and you don't have it when you want it. It's a stunt to make a point. Thing. It's a publicity stunt. That's exactly what the word I was looking for. It's just a publicity stunt. From what I have read, there are any number of people who have met that Randi challenge and walked away empty-handed. It's just a publicity stunt.
Although it is certainly a publicity stunt that is held in very high regard amongst those who are skeptical. Or was.
What's that? Yeah. Yeah, well, of course they believe it because that's what they want to believe. Tell people what they want to believe and they're not going to look too deeply into it. So that's the way it is. But there have been, Randi is not going to hand that prize to anyone, no matter what they do. That's not going to happen. So it's just a publicity stunt. It's not a real thing. And the point is, once you understand the difference between the intellectual side and the intuitive side, it's not a matter of it's not a matter of convincing other people. You'll find that you don't have any need to convince anybody else of anything. When people are not, it's like when a guy comes and knocks on your door, and he's he's one of those people that believes that the world's going to end any time now, and you need to repent and whatever. And they come around knocking on your door. Well, to have an argument with them about their religion and why you disagree with them is a waste of time, their time and your time, because they are believers. They believe what they believe, and it doesn't matter what you say to them. They will not change their mind. It's the same way with materialists. They're believers, and they're no different believer than religious believer. It doesn't matter what you say to them, they will not change their mind. It just doesn't matter. If it's a trick. Everything's a trick. So even if you say something to them or they have an experience that is paranormal, just happens to them, they'll deny it. Even to themselves, they'll deny their own experience. So there's just no point. When somebody says, well, show me, they don't understand that in the intuitive side is not the objective side. It's not a show me kind of place. It's not something you can say, oh, watch me levitate. I'm going to levitate and sign my name on the ceiling, and I'll give me a marker and I'm going to go up there and give you a signature on the ceiling. It's not the way it works. You see, people who don't understand, who think that anything that is beyond the objective has to be just like the objective, a place where you can, take out your ruler and measure it. It's not like that. In the subjective world, it has to do with mind. It has to do with understanding. It's an entirely different space. That's where these things happen. So what they're basically saying is, if you can't make the subjective objective, then it must not be true. Well, of course you can't make the subjective objective. It's subjective, you see. So the way they define what's true and what's not true is it's objective. And what's not objective is not true. Well, you can't make the subjective objective. So it's not a simple thing as, give me a sign your name on my ceiling and prove to me that you can levitate or whatever. That's not the point. They would deny it. They would, if you showed it to them on a film, they'd say, oh, that was just a trick. I know on film, toasters fly and pigs talk, on films. So there's no point in doing that. It doesn't. And if you did change that one person's mind because you did something so dramatic and you did it so often that, they'd have to eventually agree with it or commit themselves to an insane asylum, then, okay, you've converted that one person out of his, you've kicked him out of his prison, out of his belief prison. But so what? He can't tell anybody else and say, hey, look, I actually saw this, because they won't believe him.
They won't believe him. That's right.
So what's the point of doing it? You see, there's just no point. And it just doesn't work the way they think. They want an objective proof of something that's subjective. And it doesn't work that way. The only way that they can get there is to become open-minded enough to learn. And then they'll have their own firsthand information. But if they're not, if they're lost in their arrogance of the correctness of their belief, then there's really nothing you can do about that. So you just let them be. And when they're ready, they'll grow up some. If they're not ready, then they're just not ready yet. And I don't feel like it's my job to change people. They are who they are, and they'll get there when they get there. And if they're not ready, they're not ready.
Mm. Although there have been, of course, attempts to kind of demonstrate this sort of thing in the near-death experience studies of the AWARE studies, where they put a target in ICU rooms during cardiac arrest, with the hopes that someone will come out of body, report the target, and come back. And so far it seems that hasn't garnered very strong results, which of course is putting people off the idea that these are genuine. Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing, near-death experiences.
Yeah. Well, the thing that you'll have to understand, that as long as that test fails, it will get wide publicity. As soon as that test succeeds, nobody will ever know that it succeeded. You see? So it's only going to be talked about when it fails. As soon as it succeeds, everybody will keep their mouth shut, because if they say anything about it succeeding, everybody will mistrust them and think they're goofy.
Mm. Or they've been tricked themselves. Yeah.
Yes, that they're trying to trick other people. They will lose credibility. So if they said, yes, I put that up there on the top of my light, and this person, I was operating on, he read the number perfectly. And as soon as they say that out loud, their peers will all think less of them.
Yeah,
you see?
they risk their careers.
So when you say things like that, well, they've done that and it's never really worked. Nonsense. It's just like the Randy Prize. There's plenty of people that could have won Randy Prize if they want. I mean, all the remote viewers out there that are really good at remote viewing. There's lots of them, even the ones that work for the CIA. There's lots of remote viewers that could do that, but they're not going to get anything from the Randy Prize. That's not the point. The point is to do that is to show the materialists that, of course, they're correct. And when somebody does do it, it's not going to be reported. And even if they report it and tell their friends, hey, I did this and it worked, well, their friends are going to say, yeah, you're pulling my leg, right? And pretty soon they'll be quiet and their friends will be quiet. And even if it does move out 2 or 3 levels, it'll stop because the culture doesn't support it. The culture is going to inhibit that. Even if that doctor writes a little thing about it, that will never be published. It will never be made public. It just won't go very far because the culture suppresses that. You see? So this idea that it's never happened and people have never done it, that's really nonsense. People probably have done that. You'll just never hear about it because it's counter to our culture.
Of course, there are, however, many studies that have shown and do claim to show that these do take place. So that's kind of where people should look at the actual work.
Yeah, exactly. Thousands of studies have done in academia with great protocols. I mean, go read some of, let's see. I mean, you can start with the stuff that was done all back by the Rhine Institute at Duke. He kind of started it, and he has lots of things published down there. But read some of Dean Radin's books, and you'll just see study after study, and these studies, and the protocols they had, and the double blind and triple blind, and the effects that had. I mean, if you think that all this is bogus, you're just ignorant. There's tons of material out there that will show you that it's been done. The problem is that people read that, they'll read Dean Radin's book and they'll say, oh, Dean Radin must be lying. You say, oh, Duke must have a bunch of goofballs down there, It's been done. That's the point. It's been done thousands of times. There's literally thousands of credible, good science cases where the paranormal is shown to exist, to be there. I mean, it's not a matter, oh, well, nobody's ever done that. This is nonsense. The culture's never accepted that anybody's done that. That's true. But it's been done by thousands of people, thousands of places. It's fact. But if you have your head stuck in the materialistic sand and you have a belief that it can't be a fact, then you say things like, oh, well, nobody's ever gotten a Randy Prize and nobody's ever, read that little thing on the light shade in the doctor's office. That's just nonsense. It's not like that. There's just so much. So when somebody says, well, prove it, I didn't tell me, go do research. Go someplace where they do this.
There's plenty. And as the most common retort I ever hear is, well, that doesn't add much value because it's only anecdotal.
No, it's not anecdotal. And these things that I'm talking about is not anecdotal at all. It's good research. I mean, Dean Radin has been doing this now for years. He's got tons of stuff in his many books that aren't anecdotal at all. And if you think it's not true, go see Dean. Do something. If you don't read his book, you think he's a liar or something, go look him up. Get into a conversation with him. Get off your butt and go explore it. Other than just like the guy knocks on your door and wants to tell you the world's coming to an end. If you can't blast them out of their belief, then they're never going to see anything else. And materialists are in that same thing. If you really pursue it and you really put some effort into it, you will find that it is not anecdotal. It's hard fact evidence that's been repeated and repeated and repeated. And it's no different than any other science. It's there. And while if it's there, then everybody would know and it would be a big deal. No, it's there and all the believers just look the other way because that's what believers do when they get something that is not in line with their beliefs. So it's just that simple. So, they think that we are a bunch of weak-minded fools, and the fact is that they are just closed-minded believers.
And most of the time, not consciously so. The way that the society is, of course, anybody who grew up in that society will be of that opinion.
Sure.
So it's a
anybody that grows up in a strongly religious society, exactly. It's the same way, right? If you grow up in a religious society, then it's not that you have to, go out of your way to get that belief. That belief is just part of your culture. Mm-hmm. It's part of who you are. And you don't even probably know that you are a believer. I mean, we believe a lot of things that our culture tells us, that all you have to do is travel around the world and live closely with people who don't come from your culture, and you'll find out there's all kinds of things we believe that aren't really true, that we just take for granted in our culture.
And not only that, but indeed when you live with somebody of a different culture, the whole world kind of changes fundamentally, because it's such a different viewpoint, and it's amazing the different kind of perspectives you get. So let's move on slightly to when you were mentioning about the various laws that govern the non-physical, and one law you mentioned was the one-way causation from consciousness to physical. Could you not argue that we can indeed affect consciousness via physical means? For instance, if we drink alcohol or damage our heads, damage our brains, that affects the content of consciousness?
No, it doesn't affect consciousness at all. It's that people don't really understand what consciousness is. Okay, now in my model, this physical reality is a virtual reality. It's a virtual reality that is rendered. It's a virtual reality that is rendered by consciousness. Consciousness is an information system. Okay, it's all about information. And consciousness, what I call the larger conscious system, can configure itself as a computer, as a server, or it can configure itself as another individuated unit of consciousness, kind of a small subset of itself, a virtual machine inside of a mainframe, if you will. So we are that virtual machine. We're a piece of consciousness, and we are logged onto this virtual reality. So it's really us as consciousness, the player, and this physical body is the avatar. Consciousness is the computer that's rendering the virtual reality. So we're a player. Now, if you look at it that way, we're the player, and we make all the choices for the avatar. That's the body. Now, you take that body and you put that body into an accident, or it gets hit over the head with an iron bar, okay, brain damage. Now, that consciousness is not affected. The player is affected. The only thing that the consciousness now has to work with, it has to make choices for a crippled avatar. It's not a crippled consciousness. It's a crippled avatar. So now the consciousness can only make choices with an avatar that slurs its words, can't remember, and drags its left foot. That's the brain damage result. But it's not because consciousness has been damaged or affected in any way. The avatar's been affected. So the avatar basically represents the rule set of the virtual reality. All virtual realities work on a rule set. There's certain rules. The rules define all the possibilities of things that can happen in that virtual reality. Okay, so the rule set change things that happen to you, like drinking, taking LSD or getting drunk,
or developing Alzheimer's and things like that.
Yeah, or getting Alzheimer's, being hit over the head with a pipe, or getting an automobile accident or something and having brain damage. What happens is that then changes the constraints that the consciousness has to work with. That's all. It just changes the constraints the consciousness has to work with. So now it has to work with somebody who can't remember, who slurs their speech. But it's still making choices for that individual. Now, imagine you're playing a virtual reality game. Okay, so here you are, you're the player, you're logged on your computer, you got your mouse in your hand, the keyboard in front of you, the virtual reality's up on the screen, and your elf gets hit over the head with an iron bar. Oh, your elf just lost 3/4 of his hit points. And now, because of that, he limps, slurs his words, drags his left leg. Okay, well, you're the player. Didn't hurt you, you're the player. But now you got to play a damaged elf. You see, it's the same thing. So now you've got to play the damaged elf. Another thing to notice is that to the elf, the server has to be outside of its reality. From the elf's viewpoint, right? From the elf's viewpoint, the virtual reality is physical to the elf. The server is non-physical to the elf. The player is non-physical to the elf. The elf thinks he's making all his own decisions, but actually there's a player making those decisions, and that player has to be in the same reality as the server, and they both have to be non-physical to the elf. All right, well, that's just the same way we are. So our bodies are avatars. Our bodies are avatars, and our consciousness is the player. The computer that computes this virtual reality and the player are sending data back and forth. There really is no avatar. The avatar is just a computed thing, eye candy, so that the player can look and see what's going on and see interactions. It makes the game more understandable if you can actually see it. Just like if you were trying to play your elf and all you got out was printouts, it'd be really hard, right? It'd be really, really hard. So the visuals, yes, now that just makes it easier. Well, it's that sort of thing. The virtual reality doesn't really exist. It's just there for the player to make it easier for them to understand it. It's computed.
So we're effectively kind of a non-physical, from our point of view, a non-physical player playing through our physical bodies as a virtual reality character. But I suppose the difference between our experience in that case and the analogy of the virtual player on a computer screen is that, of course, the virtual player on a computer screen doesn't have kind of a self-awareness, whereas we do, and we aren't aware of the player playing through us. So
if you were an elf in World of Warcraft, you would think you had self-awareness because you did things. You came to a fight and you decide whether you run away or whether you fight. You decide whether you were going to go in that cave and tangle with the boss that lives in that cave that has all the money that you'd like to collect so you can buy better weapons. You have to make all these choices. And from the elf's viewpoint, the elf is making the choices.
Right. But in reality, it's the background consciousness controlling it, making. So many people, yes. Yeah, I see what you mean. Although many people would consider that to be more of a deterministic point of view, would they not?
No, it's not deterministic at all. That consciousness has free will, can make all sorts of choices. He can decide whether he wants to run or fight. All right. He can do this or he can do that. Those are all choices that the consciousness makes. Now you can say there is a rule set. Now the rule set is basically deterministic. The rule set says that if I pick up a rock and drop it, it's going to fall back down to the ground. It's not going to fly up into the air. It's part of the rule set here. Okay, in the World of Warcraft, it's the same thing. If your elf picks up a rock and throws it, it's going to land back down on the ground. It's not just going to fly away. If your elf stays underwater too long, he's going to drown. If your elf falls off a high cliff and lands on a rock, he's going to get hurt, right? He will lose, he will lose his health points. So it's just part of the rule set. The rule set says that if you want to get from A to B, you have to walk, not teleport. Oh, but if you're an elf, you may find a special place where you can go that teleports you to some other place. That's part of that rule set. Our rule set doesn't have any place, doesn't have any teleport centers in it.
Not yet, anyway. Yeah. Maybe one day.
So you see, yeah. that's how it works. So you have to think. If you were the elf, what would you think? You'd think you were the one making all those choices.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But when I say it seems deterministic, what I mean is that us as using the analogy of the elf. So the elf believes that it's the elf that's making all these choices, but in reality it's someone behind them making the choices for them. So the elf doesn't really have control over what he's doing, even though he thinks he does. It's whoever's controlling him that does. So in the same way that...
No, the elf doesn't exist. There is no elf. The elf is just a computation. Right, there is no elf.
Although he would have a point of view the same way we do.
No, it doesn't have a point of view. I'm just saying, if you took that point of view of the elf, you'd have this point of view. The elf is just numbers, just computation. Okay, the elf doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a circulatory system, doesn't have lungs, but yet the elf will drown if he stays underwater too long. You see, the computer just computes what happens. It doesn't have to compute things that aren't being shown. So you don't have to compute lungs in an elf or a heart beating, blood around in an elf. Although if the elf gets cut, blood may come out, you see. But you only compute what's necessary. Now, with us, it's exactly the same way. With us, you don't have to compute that there's actually a brain in our skull, or that we have lungs, or that we have, kidneys and things like that. You only compute that if somebody cuts us. Oh, then you see blood, just like the elf. Now, if that elf had elf doctors and elf surgeons that opened up the elf, then you'd see what was inside the elf. Well, if something opens up us, then you see what's inside, according to the rule set. What does the rule set say would be in there? Well, the rules are what science is all about. Science digs out the rules in the rule set. That's their job. So physics, chemistry, biology, all the rules are what scientists have dug out. At least that's what we know about the rules. There's still rules we haven't discovered yet. We haven't dug out of the rule set. And the rules are pretty much deterministic, except for some natural uncertainties that go with it. Things like a radiating radioactive source. Particles come out, but they come out in random directions. So there's some natural randomness in it. But basically, the rule set is deterministic. But the choices that the consciousness make are not deterministic. They're free will choices. Elf, go in there and fight. Elf, run away. You're not going to win this one. You see? So that's the way it is. There is no elf. The elf is just a bunch of ones and zeros in a computer. It doesn't actually exist. And when you think about virtual reality, you will realize that the virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. That's the only place the virtual reality exists, is in the minds of the players. You see, I can take this someplace. It'll be a little interesting here in a minute. In other words, if there's for something to get into the virtual reality, it first has to get into the mind of a player. The computer has to send something to the player that says, there's a rock over here. And a computer sends something to the player that there's a rock behind this tree. All right, so then your player can see that rock. If the computer doesn't send to the player that there's a rock behind that tree, then there's no rock behind the tree. You see? So the player walks around and to look to see what's behind the tree, and the system has to send to that player what's behind that tree.
In a series of ones and zeros in information.
Yeah, so there really is no rock. Those things don't exist except when the player looks at them. Matter of fact, a good example, other than World of Warcraft, which is an ancient game, would be No Man's Sky, which was a game where everything was computed on the fly. Nothing was saved. So when you play that and you look over here, you'll see what's over there. As soon as you look away, that's no longer computed. That doesn't stay for you to come back and look at it. It's just no longer computed. If you look back there, it'll be computed again. And if there was something there that was moving, when you look back, it'll be in a little different position. You see? So that's kind of the way it works. So what you see first has to come to a player. So the virtual reality exists in the minds of the player. Now you're a player and you're playing World of Warcraft. Basically, the computer sends you a data stream that lights up pixels on your screen. So you say you have 1 million pixels, and each one of those pixels gets 3 pieces of data. intensity, position, and color. And that's it. So now you're looking at 3 million pieces of data, those three variables at each location. And you look at all those little dots of light and you say, oh, there's rocks and rivers and streams and elves and girl elves and boy elves and swords. And what's all that stuff? All you're seeing is a lot of little dots of light. You see, you're interpreting the data to be that virtual reality. That's all in your mind. How did you learn that interpretation? To interpret those dots of light that way? Because when you were a child, you saw rocks and trees and things, and you learned what they were. So when you see that same kind of configuration, that's what you call it. That's what that's what you see. So the virtual reality exists only in the minds of the players. Now we'll go to quantum physics, where there's this thing called the measurement problem, or the observer paradox, where if there's no player that gets information, in this case, double slit, it's the which way information, which slit did the particle go through. If there's no player that gets that information, then you get a pattern that's an interference pattern, right? But as soon as a player gets the information of where that particle is, then that makes the particle happen right there, because they got that information. That puts the particle at that slit. And once you have a particle at that slit, well, it has to act like a particle. It just goes in a straight line like particles do until it's
because it now
interacted by another force. And basically you get two piles of particles, one behind each slit. You don't get an interference pattern anymore because you created a particle at that slit with the information that one was there. You see? So that particle comes into the reality because it is put in the mind of a player. It's data to the player. So that tells you, that solves the problem of the observer paradox. It's not a paradox, it's a virtual reality. Nothing ever comes into the virtual reality without it going to the mind of a player first. The player's required. You see, if there's no player, then if there are no players, there is no virtual reality. Think of that. What is the World of Warcraft serving up if there are no players? Nothing. It's not sending anybody any data. No data is being sent out. So because where's the virtual reality?
To interpret it.
It doesn't exist. You see? So there is no virtual reality. You remember that little boy in the Matrix? He says, there is no spoon.
I've never watched the movie, but I've seen the clip, yeah.
Yeah, so that's basically the way it is. The physical doesn't actually exist. It's just a virtual reality. So you aren't right now, the system does not have to render oxygen in your room for you to breathe. It only renders what you can see. If you get some kind of meter out that measures the oxygen, then it has to render oxygen to make the meter say, oh, your air has 20% oxygen, because that's about how much oxygen is in your air. So there's a way. I'm skipping a lot of steps. There's a way that's done. What really happens is that the system takes a random draw from all the probabilities of what the oxygen level is in your room, all the possibilities. Possibilities have to do with how many trees are around your house, how long has your doors been shut, all kinds of things, all the possibilities, and then it takes a random draw from the probability distribution, and that's the amount of oxygen you have in your room when the measurement's made. But anyway, the system doesn't have to render things that aren't seen, that aren't sensed. So if it doesn't trigger your five senses, the system doesn't render it. So it only has to render oxygen when somebody renders oxygen, because that's what the rule set says. You see? So your brain, you really don't have a brain. There is no brain in there until somebody cuts your head open, and then it has to render a brain. So the brain doesn't actually compute anything, store anything, remember anything, do any analysis. All that's done in consciousness. The brain there, though, is according to the rule set, and it sets limits and constraints on what kind of thinking, how much memory, what can be remembered. All those constraints are set by the rule set that defines the virtual reality. And the consciousness gets the data stream, but the data stream only shows him those things that are possible within the rule set. Just like the data stream to your computer will only show you what's possible in World of Warcraft. Your elf can't start flapping his arms and fly away. It won't work. No matter how much you want him to as a player, it just won't work because the rule set doesn't support that. So that's what the things that you think you're doing to your consciousness. What you're doing is you're changing the constraints which your consciousness has to work with.
Mm-hmm. So for instance, when someone develops Alzheimer's disease or some form of dementia where they can no longer remember, it's not that the memories themselves are no longer there in the brain as it degrades. It's that the brain is the constraint that allows access to memories which are actually in consciousness.
Yes. Yeah, and it's not so much the access, but that's probably a good way to put it. It's just that you have Alzheimer's and now you've got all this aluminum caked in your brain or some other kind of thing, plaque and stuff that inhibits it from functioning properly. So that's a constraint on what the consciousness can do. So the consciousness cannot interact with all the memories and with all the things. Your children come to see you and you have Alzheimer's and you don't recognize them. Okay, well, your consciousness won't recognize them. It'll say, no, don't know you, because the constraint is such that you don't recognize anybody. It's just a constraint. And that's because according to the rule set, you're no longer capable of that recognition. So the computer only sends data according to the rule set. Mm-hmm. So the consciousness is only getting data from the computer according to what the rule set allows. So what the consciousness is getting is this foggy vision of a little bit of nothing. Yeah, there's somebody there, but I really don't know who they are. See, that's what the consciousness is getting, because that's what the computer sends to the consciousness. The computer sends things according to the rule set.
Right, I see. So because you have that plaque in the brain and the Alzheimer's disease, the consciousness within which the information of being able to identify your children, whatever, exists, doesn't send that information through because the rule set and the state of the brain dictates that can't happen.
Right. So see, it's when you're playing World of Warcraft, the only thing that you know about what's going on is what the computer sends you. Computer puts dots on your screen and you say, oh, these dots mean such and such. Well, in this case, your elf has dementia. And when you say, somebody walks in the room, the computer, the data they send you is, I don't know who that is.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Because that's according to the rule set.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes more sense to me. So I suppose that
so
kind of
it's not that the consciousness has all the information, but it just can't get to it for some reason. It doesn't. That what it gets sent, for the virtual reality is confusion. Mm. It just gets sent confusion.
Yeah. So many people report. It leads on to kind of what happens after physical death, because many people report in cases like near-death experiences and terminal lucidity that at the point of death, even if they were suffering from some sort of memory, brain degrading issue, within the first few hours or so close to death or immediately after their physical death, they report being able to know everything again, restoring full lucidity, which leads me to believe that something like terminal lucidity is the spirit leaving the constraints of the brain. So I suppose with your model of the virtual reality comparison, what would be the experience of the individual in a position like that after death?
Okay, when they die, when a person dies, and if you like, we can walk through the situation of what death is and what happens and what's going on there. But when that person dies, they're no longer an active player in the virtual reality. Just like when your elf dies, he's no longer an active player in the virtual reality. So when that's the case, then the person who's just died finds themselves in a different virtual reality, but not this virtual reality. Okay, and that's because consciousness is the player, right? So the way it works is that you have a consciousness, what I call an individuated unit of consciousness. That's you. That's really the fundamental you. Now, what that individuated unit of consciousness does, and like I said, it's like a virtual machine inside the mainframe consciousness. It's just a subset of the larger conscious system.
It's kind of an idealistic point of view.
Yeah. Yes. The individuated unit of consciousness partitions off a part of itself that contains only its quality. That is how far it has evolved up to this point. It's really measured in entropy, of that consciousness. So it's the quality of that consciousness gained, how much it has evolved to this point. That's all that's in that little, I call that a free will awareness unit. It's in a little partitioned off piece of the individuated unit of consciousness. That free will awareness unit is what is really getting the data stream from the server. That's the one making choices and decisions. So when that avatar dies, that free will awareness unit starts getting two things happen. One, it gets a data stream that shows it the after death information that it gets. It may see light, all the things, the near death experiences, right? It may see light. It may see relatives. It may see other things. Well, it gets that is now a different virtual reality. And at the same time as that's going on, that partition is being taken down because it's no longer needed anymore. That was just a partition for playing that avatar. That partition gets taken down, and that thing that was a free will awareness unit just becomes a part of the individuated unit consciousness again. So all of that happens as death comes. Now, if that person has an immediate awareness of, say, the life he just lived, he was maybe lying in bed and had family around him, or maybe he just got run over by a cement truck or something, but he's got an immediate awareness of that. If he thinks about it, the system will give him that, but it fades like a dream fades. You know how when you wake up from a dream, as soon as you wake up, wow, it's all there. A minute later, it's sort of there. I kind of got most of it. And, 10 minutes later, you got the gist of it, but you've lost all the detail. And, next day.
You only retain the important parts that were emotionally.
The next day, it's really kind of gone and you don't really remember it very well. That's the way it is. So the past life you had, it for the instant, it's immediately there. And then it's not so there, not so there, not so there. And it basically goes away. And you find yourself in another reality frame. And I call that the transition reality because that's the frame in which you then transition back to a new avatar. It's a transition from one avatar to another, just a different virtual reality. Okay, and in that virtual reality, the whole point of it is to let people relax and let go and get ready for a new experience, to log on to a different avatar. So that's the whole point of it. So that tends to be a not very rich experience space, because that's not the point. It's kind of a dull, boring space because it's for you to just relax and let go of what you've just been, kind of, come back to being the individuated unit of consciousness sort of thing, and then starting to think about what it is you'd like to do next. If you've been around enough times to care about what it is you do next. In the early stages, you don't care what you do next. You just need more experience. But eventually you think about what you want to do next. And maybe it helps you understand things. If you need it, you may get a life review. If you don't need it, you don't. This process can be extremely short if you don't need it, because you've been around enough that you can skip through it. Or it could be rather lengthy if it takes you a while to decompress from all the beliefs and other things that you carry with you. But mostly it's a very easy process. It's not difficult. The only people that have even minor difficulties with it are people who are obsessed with something. If they come into it obsessed, then that's something that it's harder for that consciousness to let go of. It's a little more difficult for them to just let go and, let it drift off, because they just keep grabbing at it and grabbing. They're obsessed with it. So those are the only problems. But even that doesn't take that long before the obsession finally winds itself out, and they move on. So that's what goes on. That partition comes down, the dream begins to fade, the dream that was your physical life begins to fade. Then the system will do whatever it takes to help you feel at ease, to help you feel okay, that everything's fine, that it's going to be positive. And the only really bad experiences that people have is ones that are really have an obsession, let's just say a very strong belief in something negative is going to happen. If they have that very strong belief that something negative is going to happen, then that's what they get first. They have to work out of that. They have to, like I say, they got to wind themselves out of that obsession first. So then you have negative. But mostly what people get is, and it depends. If the system, see, this is an avatar. So the system always has track of the probabilities. So the system knows what the probability is that they're not going to die, that they're going to, they're going to go back. And if they're going to go back, and it's going to be a very brief visit, then the system will just give them something typically very positive to experience. It may even give them the experience of interacting with the larger system itself, interacting with what consciousness is, and that's the white light. And they come to the white light, and suddenly they no longer have their identity, but they're just one with everything, and yada yada yada. That's a typical experience. A person who meditates can have that experience whenever they wish. You don't have to almost die to have that experience. It's just a matter of kind of connecting with the larger system and kind of being a piece of that larger system, seeing and feeling as that larger system sees and feels. So sometimes that's given to people just to give them something positive to take back. Give them something that they can come back and say, wow, here's what happened to me, and to get excited about and to share, because as they share it with other people, that opens other people's minds. It's part of a process of opening minds to be, to see that there are possibilities other than material possibilities. So it's part of the process of doing that. So the near-death experience is pretty much whatever the system thinks that person can handle, what they can do, what they can need, what they need. And some people won't have that kind of an experience because they're really not ready for that experience. You see, they would kind of be in denial of it, or it would frighten them. And if that's the case, then you don't give them that kind of experience, because it's going to cause them more damage than good. They'll come back more fearful than they were when they went there in the first place. So it depends. The system gives people what they need, basically, and with an idea of how much are they going to spread it and how many minds will it open. So that's kind of the system's viewpoint. And
that would make sense, especially with the near-death experiences, and I suppose experiences that people call astral projection, is that they seem to be very mind-oriented in the sense that people will see what they expect or want to see. So some people who are devout Christians who have a near-death experience or an astral projection experience will meet Jesus, or other religious deities. Others that want to, create kind of a universe of their own to control will go and be able to make things out of thin air and do all this sort of thing. Others who are fearful will see hell or a hot fire pit. So and that's it's often been used as of course then this is all in the mind, it's all an illusion. Whereas as you say, I think it's much more an environment where the mind is it's much more liquid, the environment, to the mind's intentions.
It is. You see, you're in another virtual reality. You're getting another data stream. You're getting information from another source. So the source of that data stream is the larger consciousness system. Now, we're in this system in order to grow up, increase the quality of our consciousness, to evolve. That's the point. The whole system is evolving, and we're part of that evolution. So when you do an out-of-body, basically, that's a terrible name, out of body. There's nothing in your body that comes out of your body. That's just nonsense. But you're basically getting a single player game from the larger conscious systems, giving you a data stream that gives you an experience. Now, what kind of experience are you going to have? What is the system going to give you? Okay, here you are. You've just gotten out of body, so the system's going to give you a data stream. What will it give you? Well, one, if it's trying to give you some sense of things being okay, or trying to help you negotiate around your fears, you see, it may give you, it may come to you in such a way, it may appear as something you trust, like maybe Jesus if you're religious, or maybe some kind of guru, in a robe with a long white beard, if you're not, or maybe
even a
just
deceased loved one or something like that.
Yeah, a deceased loved one. If you happen to be in Asia and you're one of those people that have ancestors, whatever, it'll be one of your ancestors. So it's going to give you something that you can relate to. Imagine if the system decided to give everybody a talking three-headed chicken. Nobody would pay any attention, right? They'd all think it's nonsense and they wouldn't believe a thing they said. So if it wants to get some idea across to you, it has to come in a form that's credible, in a form that means something to you. Now, one of the things it may do if you're doing out of body, because you're doing this on purpose, you're not dying, you're just going out of body, it may give you a fear test to see how much fear you have. Because if you have too much fear, you shouldn't be there, because you're going to run into all kinds of fearful things. You're going to come back more fearful than you left, because what's the fear you're going to run into, there's your own. You're going to create fearful things there. So in that case, you'll get a fear test. First thing that happens when you pop out of body, some monster will jump up and go boo, and some thug will come up and try to beat you up, and all these things will happen that are negative because you're not ready to be there yet. Now, if you are ready to be there, then the monster comes and you go, "Hi, monster. How's it going? Have a nice day." You'll give it a hug and go on. The monster will just go poof and disappear. Or the thugs that are beating you will just disappear.
Because they're your own creation.
Right, because you're ready for the growth. You don't have the fear. So the fear test is to turn those that aren't ready back, and to the ones that are ready just don't have that fear. They just pass right through it. So even though the system will send them an image of something fearful, they won't process that. They won't latch onto it. They won't say, oh no, what's that big thing going to do? See, that's their own fear. If it's, oh, okay, a big thing with 3 heads, long teeth, and, high thing, and they won't process it in a fearful way because they're not fearful, then that means the system can do something else. It can give them something more meaningful. So the system will give tests. The system will give information that you're ready for. If you come there with the idea that, oh, okay, it's all about good and evil, and there's evil out there, and I'm going to fight the evil, then what you're going to spend your time doing is martial arts. You're going to be out there fighting evil all the time, because that's where you are in your evolution. You're at the point where you're fighting, you want to fight evil because you see that is progress, is in fighting enemies and making them go away, or killing enemies. And if that's the mind state you're in, that's what you'll be doing. So
it's almost a case then that, with out-body experience as well, but also at death, which is effectively kind of it happens to you whether you're ready or not.
Yeah.
Right. What you'll experience after death is what you believe will happen to you after death.
No, what you experience after death is basically what the system wants to send you to get you to relax and get ready to move on. So you end up in another virtual reality. The system at that point isn't trying to teach you something or help you grow up. You're transitioning, and now it wants to help you let go of the old and get ready for the new. So that's what you get immediately after death. When you're just going out of body, well, that's a learning opportunity. Okay, you're logging on to a single player game with the LCS, and it's going to send you something that's going to help you. And it has to start from wherever you are. You see, if what you are is into killing the bad guys, then you'll get a lot of that. But hopefully it has to start from wherever you are. And then it'll take that and gradually move you away from that being the main point of your existence. It'll kind of wean you off the violence kind of thing and get you into something else. But it can't just start from where you're not. It has to start from where you are. So immediately you will get things that suit you. But it will then have it's the one making up the story. So it will give you more and more opportunities to make better choices than just fighting. It'll give you more opportunities, and you will at first neglect those opportunities. You'll just grab onto the ones with the fighting, but eventually you'll grow past that. So the system is actually trying to help you evolve the quality of your consciousness when you're out of body. It gives you a learning situation, something in which you can make choices. Remember Bob Monroe's books? All of these things that he were getting were all learning things, right? He'd go talk to this person and talk to that one, and he'd get this idea and, this big ring of this and that. And it was all about telling him things that would help him learn, but he had to do the learning. He had to be ready for what the learning was. If you come in there and you have a lot of beliefs, then the system has to work with those beliefs. It's because it can't, that's where you are. So it has to start from where, and that's true of any communication. When you communicate something, if you've got some friend and you'd really like to tell him something, you can't start from where you are and say, here's what I am, and here's what I know, and you need to come to here and be like me. You need to start from wherever they are and help them take a step in that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a little step and another step and another step, because people have to get there on their own or it's not real for them.
Mm-hmm. So then the lessons that are learned in one life, are they then carried on in a constant evolution through the next lives, the next lives, etc.?
Yeah, the point is to evolve. Consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy. Lowering its entropy means creating more useful and more meaningful order, more meaningful configurations growing up. Now, we're in a social system because there's lots of these individuated consciousness, and we're in a social system with each other and with the larger consciousness system. In a social system, you minimize entropy by cooperating and caring. If you have a social system, you make it more effective if you all share and if you all care. The opposite of that is if you have a lot of fear, then you don't have any trust, and it's all about you. Then you have a social system, and it's all a bunch of individuals. It's all about them. Well, that does not optimize anything. What happens that if you let that evolve, however it does, you end up with kind of a warlord mentality where there's a few people on top that own almost everything, and then you got a few mid-level managers that are usually not very nice, and then you got a bunch of peasants at the bottom. That's the way that ends up. Okay, whereas if you have the group I call the love group, who care and share, then everybody cares that everybody else gets what they need, what they want. So the whole system tries to reconfigure itself to optimize every member in the system. And you get maximum amount of free choice there, maximum amount of things that you can do and things that you can be. So that's our purpose here in this virtual reality. This virtual reality is really an entropy reduction trainer. Just like a flight trainer teaches pilots how to be pilots, how to fly. This is an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. So we log on to this and we make choices. And by those choices, we evolve or de-evolve the quality of our consciousness. By lowering entropies, a higher quality of consciousness. When you die, you get to keep that quality that you've earned. Okay, now if you make poor choices, you de-evolve. You lower your quality of consciousness. So it can go either way. So let's say you've made a lot of good choices, you raised your quality of consciousness. Now the next time you log on to an avatar, you start at a higher quality of consciousness. But when that free will awareness unit puts that, the IUOC makes the partition, creates the free will awareness unit, the only thing it takes with it is its quality of consciousness. It doesn't take with it any memory. just as quality of consciousness. So when it gets that data starts flowing to it from that avatar, it thinks that data, that's the first experience of its existence.
Its existence, yeah.
It sees that as the first experience. So it thinks that it is that avatar because all of its experience is the avatar's experience. You see, because it doesn't come with any old experience. It just comes with its quality. So that's why you believe that you are, you are the player. You think you are the consciousness because all of your experience is the only experience you've ever had. So that makes you identify as, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It's real good virtual reality. You have to identify as the avatar.
And so, being able to remember what you were before would almost kind of ruin the point of learning anew and developing further.
Exactly. It would have a bunch of downsides. One, if you could remember all the things you were, you would have, 25,000 children that you just loved to death and loved you. You'd have, 10,000 husbands or wives that were just the light of your life. And so on. That's just too much. It's way too much information to keep up with. That's one thing. And you say, well, you could just maybe keep the last 2 or 3. But even that is not a good idea because we learn most from diversity. We learn from having to deal with new things. If you just kind of do the same sort of things with the similar kind of people, then you don't learn very much. You learn by having to express who you are freshly in a new situation. Otherwise, if you came in with memory, what you do, instead of learning anything, you just act. You try to game the system. Okay, here's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to, act nice. I'm supposed to be kind. I'm supposed to be caring and cooperative. So I'll just act that way. Well, you don't grow up any by acting. It's not about behavior. It's about who you are. There's a big difference between being kind and acting kind. Real big difference. So if you act the part, you're not going to grow any. You have to be the part. So the way that you be the part is that you don't come in with any information. And then what happens? You just are who you are. You can't help but be the part because you don't have anything else. You don't have any information to try to game the system, to act or to do anything different. So you have to start that way. That optimizes your ability to learn by not having all of that information come in with you because it makes all of your choices authentic.
Kind of in the way that, with my interviews, I never pre-prepare questions or share questions and answers because to do it organically is the best way to learn.
Exactly. It's the same thing. So that's why, that's why we come in with the quality, but that quality then can keep growing. If the next time you also increase that quality a little bit by good choices. Good choices are choices that lower entropy for not only yourself, but for the system, because you're a part of the system. Your evolution is the system's evolution.
It's a very similar system to Darwinian evolution for physical beings. That different mutations take place until it works, and whether it's good or not, it doesn't matter. It keeps doing it and develops.
Right. It's exactly that. That's the way evolution works. It's exactly the same way. And my model of reality is basically very much a model like Darwin's. I start with the most elementary piece of consciousness imaginable, which is just something that is aware that it can be in state 1 or state 2. That's all. That's kind of the simplest element of consciousness. It has awareness and it has choice. That's how I define consciousness: awareness with choice. So if you have awareness and its only choice is I can be in state 1 or state 2, then that's the simplest piece of consciousness you can hit. And from there, I let that evolve and show how it has to evolve. The evolution is something that if you know what the criteria are, you know how it has to evolve. The criteria here is lowering entropy. That's because consciousness is an information system. An information system where all the bits are random has no information. It's all random. There is no information. As it orders those bits, it creates information. As that ordering means something significant, then it lowers its entropy even more. Okay, so information systems evolve by lowering their entropy, creating information. having that information becoming more valuable, more useful. All right. So now you are an individuated unit of consciousness, and you're trying to lower your entropy. And we said in a social system, lowering your entropy means being caring and kind and helpful. You know, what can I give? How can I help? Not what can I take and how can I get it? So that's how those are the choices you make. Now, good, right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil are defined in terms of entropy. A choice that lowers entropy for you and for the system, not for you at expense of other people. You know, not that you lower your entropy, but it's going to raise entropy of 10 other people. Well, that's a loss for the system. So it has to lower entropy for you and the system. And if it does that, that defines good. If it doesn't do that, it's not good. So if it just comes out neutral, then it's neutral. If it comes out that it actually raises entropy, it's bad. So we have morality. What is morality? It has to do with whether or not you're lowering or raising entropy with your choices. So that defines right and wrong, good or bad. And that is not relative. That is absolute. That's just the nature of the system. So you're here to make choices. And because of those choices, by the quality of those choices, you'll evolve or de-evolve what I call the quality of your consciousness, or you'll lower the entropy of your consciousness. You'll make choices that will move toward lowering entropy, making more information that's more valuable and more useful. And in a social system, that means more cooperative, more caring, more loving. So we're here to become love. That's our
overall end
That's
goal.
our reason. That's our point. That's why we're here. That's why the virtual reality exists. And one thing I didn't mention is this virtual reality is not programmed by the system. It's evolved by the system. The system starts with a set of initial conditions and a rule set. That's all. Those initial conditions are what you've learned from Big Bang Theory. You know, the initial conditions are a ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the run button is hit and time starts to click, well, that ball of plasma changes according to the rule set. The rule set is physics. So it's hot, high pressure. It expands. As it expands, it cools. And, all the other kinds of things that we know about physics. And you end up with suns and planets and so on. So it starts with those initial conditions in a rule set. And then it starts that simulation. And as that simulation starts to go, what happens is that the first time it runs, it probably bombs. It doesn't run very long. So I'm going to deal gravity down just a little bit. That didn't work too well. Okay, now let's run it again. Oh, that didn't work. I'm going to deal, it changes constants, the initial conditions. It changes the initial conditions and the rule set such that it works. So that's why we have this thing in physics where we have these bunch of constants. There's like 4 or 5 constants called universal constants. And if any one of them changed in the 10th decimal place, the universe would have gone unstable by now and disappeared. So that's a fact in physics. And it's a big paradox, because how is it that we have this whole set of numbers that have to be exactly what they are to 10 decimal places, or the whole thing would blow up? It wouldn't work. How did that come about? How did they all get so just perfectly tuned to each other? Well, digital Big Bang, take 1. Digital Big Bang, take 2. You just keep doing it, adjusting this parameter, adjusting that parameter, until you have something that's stable. That's why you end up with a whole set of numbers that are tuned perfectly for each other in order to create a stable universe. There's no other explanation for it. So see, that just falls.
Yeah. So behind those adjustments, is there a sentience and awareness?
The larger consciousness system. It's consciousness.
Consciousness
is awareness with a choice. So yes, the system is aware. The system has choices also. So we're just a piece of that system, and we have awareness, and we have memory, and we have processing capability and all that. We're just a chip off that old block. So we have all those attributes. We just have it in a smaller package. But yes, that system is aware. So what it said is, I have all these individuated unit of consciousness, but their evolution is kind of slow because all they're doing is communicating with each other, because that's what consciousness does. They're aware of each other, so they communicate. The first virtual reality is just communication protocols. Okay, so now they're all communicating with each other, but there's nothing that really is pushing them or challenging them, or there's nothing that really matters that much. So in order to speed up evolution, I'm going to create this virtual reality for them, and now they're going to have to live within the constraints of that rule set, and that rule set is going to create a lot of choices that are life and death, meaningful, consequential, moral, ethical choices that you have. And now they will grow up a lot faster because they're in this entropy reduction trainer that's going to give them choices that will help them grow. Well, it'll help them de-evolve too if they make poor choices.
Yeah.
But eventually they'll de-evolve for a while and make things worse and worse for themselves in this thing until the pain gets so bad that they start going the other way. They start making better choices. So it's part of, it's a schoolhouse. So we get to learn. Yeah. So that's why we have the system. And yes, the larger conscious system is the server. It is also us. We're a piece of it. So yes, that's as you said, idealism. Yeah, we're all one. We're all one thing. There's no duality. We are pieces of the system. The system is all the reality there is. And we can't get outside the system because we are the system. You can't go outside of yourself.
So while this current system, the physical universe, was kind of evolving and resetting and evolving, do you think there were other virtual reality systems in which kind of we were individuating into the same kind of reality that you say we go to after death, but with different set rule sets?
There were all sorts of virtual realities, yes, generated. So virtual reality is basically just a rule set, and the rule set creates a context. It tells what you can do inside that virtual reality. So if you're just in the big chat room, the only rules are about communication. How do you communicate? So you've got that. If you wanted everybody to have a face, well, then you'd have to give them, a way to construct, what they look like. Well, now that could be part of the rule set. Okay, everybody gets a face, or everybody gets a body. And then you could make it interactive. Well, everybody can interact with each other kind of physically, they can touch each other's face. So you can make the rules however you want them. So once you have this concept that you are consciousness, you can kind of create virtual realities on your own. You as consciousness can create a virtual reality. We do that often. We call it a daydream, right? We create a virtual reality, in a daydream. But in any case, so yes, there are other virtual realities, and the larger conscious system did not put all its eggs in this basket. It had other virtual realities. I've been to multiple other systems, other virtual realities, and they're similar to this in that there are IUOCs who have free will awareness units who are logged on to characters and are all trying to make choices. All of that's the same. But they're very different than this, because their universe evolved differently. They didn't end up the way we did because there's, how it is with evolution. Things just happen. And if it works, you go on. Well, different things just happen. So it evolves and different things work, for different reasons, and it goes on. So it evolves differently. So they're different reality frames. But they're just like this one. Each one, just like this one, has its own clock. Has its own delta T, has its own level to which its entities have evolved. Its avatars have evolved. You had all these avatars in this reality. At first, there was nothing here but jellyfish and other things, and they didn't really have a lot of choice-making capabilities either. They had some, but they didn't have much. Their choices were small, but they kept evolving. Now we're into, just like I started with a single cell, let's call it, of consciousness and let it evolve. Biologists start with a cell, a physical cell, and let it evolve. And then you have single-celled things like bacteria, and then you have multi-celled things. And then they evolved up to where you had multi-celled things with cell differentiation, like organs and other things, and so on up it goes. Each one of those is a lower entropy configuration, more order. It can do more. It makes it more flexible, able to do more. So it lowers its entropy. Evolution physical evolution mirrors conscious evolution precisely. It starts the same way. It evolves up, and now we have us. We're the humans, and we have these opposable thumbs that let us rearrange all sorts of stuff here on this planet and get into all kinds of mischief, as well as create really good things too. And now we have lots of choices that are dramatically important to us. And if you wonder how come we're so negative? How come people have so much negativity in them? Where did all that come from? What happened is that when you had all of us IUOCs in the chat room, we had potential. We had tremendous potential of all the things we might become, but we didn't have the experience that helped us become any of them. It was all just potential that was sitting there very slowly growing a little bit, but not really maturing very much. So when the system said, well, we have to fix that, we're going to give them a virtual reality where they're going to have more consequences, more important, more challenges. Well, the first thing that happened when we got challenged is we did what came natural, which is we grabbed, we took. We were hungry, and if we didn't get something to eat, we're going to starve, and those people over there have something to eat, and I'm big and they're small, I'm going to take it from them. Oh, there's this other critter. Maybe I'll just kill that critter and eat it, whatever. So we used. It was all about us. We were very self-centered. We had our own families, our own kids, our own need for shelter and food, and we got it however we could. Well, as we evolved, you see, we got to a point where the shelter and the food maybe weren't so hard anymore. We could grow up some, and then it wasn't so hard for anymore. And then every day wasn't that you were you were almost killed 5 times every day, and then it became you were almost killed 5 times only every year, and things got better and better, and we could grow up and evolve and move into new spaces and generate our sense of right and wrong and honor and all those other higher concepts, justice, So all of that came, but you have to start at the bottom. You don't start at the top. You have to earn all of that. You have to develop that potential. The potential was just potential. And we didn't have the quality to say, oh, I'm starving, but it's not mine, so I won't take it. We didn't have that. We were just in a chat room. We'd never developed that kind of quality. So the only way you develop it is you start at the bottom and work your way up. And that's what we've been doing for 200,000 years that Homo sapiens been running around the planet. We've been on that evolutionary process. And the thing, what we did, we started out in the fear group, right? Which was, you end up with warlords and just a few people owning all the stuff. Well, that's where we've been for almost all of that 200,000 years. But evolution accelerates because the more you evolve, the easier it is to evolve more. Just like knowledge, the more you learn and understand, the easier it is to learn more and understand more. You see, the higher you climb up the mountain, the more you can see. It's that kind of thing. So we've been evolving, and it's been like a slow thing. Let's see, I have to make it go from this side to this side. It's a slow curve, and it shoots up. But it starts out real slow, and then goes up ever so slightly, but then goes up fast. And right now, we're on the knee of that curve. Things have just, we're right at the part where we're starting to transition into a steeper slope. So if you just look back 200-300 years, you'll see that things were a lot tougher and meaner than they are now. We've grown up some. You go back 500 years, and it's even more obvious, or 1,000 years, and you'll see life was really cheap. Go back 10,000 years, and you're back at take whatever you can, kind of a thing. So we still have that warlord mentality that we're hanging on to. but we're starting to outgrow it. It's good. So that curve is getting steeper. We're learning more faster. And I think in another couple of decades, we're liable to take a great leap forward. Probably the first, this is the first time ever that humanity's been in a position to take a great leap forward. We've always had people that understood the big picture. I mean, look at the Buddha. 2,500 years ago, he said, this reality isn't fundamental. This reality is an illusion. Well, that's the same as saying it's a virtual reality. He didn't have the term virtual reality then to say that, but he understood the big picture. It's all about caring. It's about love. It's about giving. It's not about being greedy and grabbing things. So he got that, but it's always been in the margins. And a lot of people have gotten that. The Buddha's not the only one. There's been a lot of people have gotten that, but it's always been in the margins and has never gone mainstream. The mainstream is still basically in the warlord mentality, trying to work through it. But we finally have gotten to the point where it can get into the mainstream. And I think it will get into the mainstream. And that's because, and I think that it's going to be the physicists that start that ball rolling, and not because they're aware that they're starting a ball rolling. They won't have any idea. Matter of fact, they'd probably try to quit if they had any idea. But they will, in the near term, come to the conclusion that this is a virtual reality. And it's just better science. Everything's pointing there. Already they say this is an information-based reality. Well, that's basically the same thing, except they don't want to say anything more than that, because then they'd have to answer questions like, oh, who's the programmer? Where's the computer? So they just leave it at this is an information-based reality. And when somebody says, well, what's that mean? They say, we don't know. It's just an information-based reality. But they will gather the courage and the knowledge to finally make that statement that this is a virtual reality. Hopefully, they will also understand that consciousness is the computer. Otherwise, we'll have some more hardship to go through. But when they do that, then it will go mainstream, because right now, the high priests of Western culture, which is pretty much world culture these days, the high priests of Western culture are scientists. The scientists tell us what's right. The scientists tell us what's true. 500 years ago, the high priests were all religious. They told people what was true, and the people believed it. Now the scientists tell people what's true, and the people will believe it. So when the scientists say, yea, verily, this is a virtual reality, then it'll go mainstream, because that's where we are. So we're getting close to the point where science is going to kick this ball mainstream, and they won't really mean to do it. It'll be accidental. My metaphor is you have this great big round ball sitting right on the edge of a very steep slope. And there's a bunch of physicists with crowbars trying to get that ball to move. And they don't want it really to roll away. They just want to get it out of its divot. And when they do, there'll be no stopping it, because even though the scientists aren't going to say virtual reality, somebody else will, and it'll stick because it's true. It's obvious that that's what it is. And pretty soon, everybody else is going to be saying, who's the programmer? Where's the computer? And they're going to be looking for answers, because now this just changes. It's ripped up the philosophical ground under almost everything when they get there. So when that happens, there'll be so many questions. And when we get there, people realize that, love is the answer. If they look at logical flow, which takes them there, and they'll get there someday, they will. But if they get that sooner, it'll be nicer. If they have to go through a lot of negative stuff first, it'll be tougher. But I think we're getting close to that, where that knee of that curve starts to go faster. And, those curves don't have to always be monotonic. They can zig and zag and go up a little and down a little. If you look at the detail of that curve, it's not just a straight line going up. It's, all kinds of zigs and zags as it goes. So we may have some drops, or we may just shoot on up there. I don't know.
As long as that trend remains positive, though, we'll get there. Yeah. Yeah,
we'll get there sooner or later. We will absolutely get there, because evolution is very, very slow, but it's also relentless. Evolution just keeps on chugging. No matter what you do to it, it just keeps on moving for wherever it is you take it. It just keeps on going. from there. So that's its goal, is to lower its entropy, and that's where we'll end up eventually.